Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Ren in Beijing. Some scholars believe China and the U.S. experience a lack of trust in their bilateral relations. And with China quickly rising, many in the United States worry that their country's supremacy will come under threat. However, Chinese leaders deny any intention to undermine America. How will China-U.S. relations evolve in the future? Will the South China Sea become a major issue in their bilateral relations? And how will the changing international system play out in the near future? In this edition of Dialogue, Professor Yan Xuetong, director of the Institute of International Relations at Tsinghua University, will share his views on these questions in the first part. And in the second half of the program, when we come back, we'll have Professor Dennis Wilder, a senior fellow with the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues at Georgetown University. But first, let's look at this.
As China continues to grow in strength, the rest of the world still has doubt about China's commitment to rise peacefully. What will be the biggest challenge facing China's peaceful rise? The United States has been flexing its military muscle in the South China Sea. Why is the U.S. stepping up its activity in the region?
Today I will visit the aircraft carrier USS John C. Stennis sailing in the South China Sea.
Can tensions over the South China Sea derail Sino-U.S. ties? In less than a year, the United States will have a new president. Will the new U.S. leader continue Obama's pivot to Asia policy?
Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Yan. Great changes have taken place in China's neighboring countries, but what do you think are the major challenges that we have to do risk and threat assessment about China's peaceful rise?
Nowadays, China repeatedly tell the world and to ensure the world that China's rise will be peaceful. But many countries do not believe it. So they still regard China as a threat. Actually, this kind of opinion is not appeared in the recently, and it started from the early 1990s, as soon as the Cold War ended. And so there's some media talking about the China threat. It has been lasted for 20 years. So what it means? It means that now we cannot get rid of this kind of opinion, but then we can continuously to make the world realize that China's rise and bring benefit to them. So nowadays I found that some people try to reduce this kind of opinion or try to overcome this kind of voice. That, from my understanding, that's impossible. But it's possible, make more and more people to realize that, and they benefit from China's rise.
When you talk about the negative comments on China's peaceful rise, don't you think your own image comes across as a threat, quote unquote, because you come across as China's Mirza Heimel, a very hawkish scholar about international studies. Looking back, what do you think of your international studies, and why do you think you have been regarded by those who observe China's development as a hawk?
Okay. For quite a long time, I argued that it is impossible to reduce the strategic conflicts between China and the U.S. The conflicts between China and the U.S. will become deepened and widened. And that means it will spread into more and more fields. So people will naturally jump to the conclusion. And if the conflicts between China and the U.S. increase, it will inevitably lead to war. So that's why the people concerned my argument is very hawkish. Actually, that's not my argument. I only argue that the conflicts will be inevitable, but it's possible to manage these conflicts and to make the competition peaceful, just like Khrushchev suggested, a peaceful competition during the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so that means, and just because the conflict is inevitable, so we need to manage these conflicts and to avoid these conflicts escalating into war. So the difference between me and Mr. Hammer is that he concerned the war between China and the U.S. is inevitable, but I don't think there's the direct war between China and the U.S. will occur. I argue that the nuclear weapons and globalization will provide a great chance for China and the U.S. to prevent direct war between these two countries.
In the very first term of President Obama's presidency, they started to talk about back to Asia, and that caused many Chinese people to worry. Do you think if you take a close look at the maritime disputes in the South China Sea, we are in the collision course, and do you think there's the necessity to manage the crisis, if any?
Yeah. I think the Obama's policy, so-called the pivot policy or the rebalancing policy in Asia Pacific, and the current maritime disputes between China and the U.S. Over the South China Sea, and supporting my arguments that means strategic conflicts between China and the U.S. Will be inevitable. But meanwhile, it's also indicate that these conflicts are manageable. So people have talking about the strategic competition between China and the U.S. for 2 decades. Then what happened? No war and no military, no exchange of fire between the soldiers of these two countries. And especially recently, you find that, and both China and the U.S. adopt a very good strategy, and we call it a transparency strategy. And each side will early announce what they are going to do on the South China Sea. And so make the other side do not be surprised. So since both sides adopt a no surprising policy toward the other sides, I think both China and the U.S. can manage the conflicts over the China Sea.
But some of those who question the American surveillance missions in the South China Sea would say, this is a kind of a containment policy. But you would argue containment is the word typical of the Cold War. So what do you think of the latest mission by 6 fighter jets that left the Clark Air Base in the Philippines to conduct what they call the situational awareness flights under the nose of the Chinese Navy in Huangyan Island?
The U.S. Obviously strengthened its military relationship with its allies in this region and try to contain China from especially Chinese naval power get out of this region. But meanwhile, you find that this strategy is very different from what they adopted during the Cold War. And this policy combined with the transparency. For instance, when they send these troops or air flights to this region, and they immediately make an announcement why they want the world to know they are doing something. And from my understanding, there's 2 purposes. One is want China to protest. Only when they need China to protest their military action.
To create some media hype and noise. To capture front-page stories.
To understand that now the U.S. really adopt a tough policy towards China. And second, they want their allies to understand that, the U.S. is reliable. You see, the U.S. take actions against China. So you see, from my understanding, this kind of strategy is have a political goal rather than a military goal. So if both China and the U.S. can politically to make the other side not surprised, but also know the other side will adopt some unfavorable policy toward themselves, and I think the peaceful competition will continue smoothly.
Let's look at China policy during the Obama administration. We've talked about the pivot to Asia and the enormous efforts by the Obama administration to rebalance the growing influence of China in this region. Look at the implications of a TPP, just to name one example. Do you think his successor, because this is the election year for the United States, do you think his successor will continue to limit and restrict the influence of China?
Well, first, I think most people always regarded the TPP and the rebalance strategy are 2 sides of one strategy. I do not take over this view. I think these are 2 strategies. And the TPP is an economic strategy for the U.S. to try to regain its influence on the trade, and rather than use it to contain China. This has nothing to do to contain China, and maybe there's a competition. But the rebalance strategy is very clear, and the aim is to balancing China. But the TPP is not balancing China. Okay, what I want to argue, I mean that I do not think the TPP will compose a serious threat or the negative impact on China. And China already is the world's largest trader. And I don't think the U.S. has that capability to balance China's economic influence at this moment, especially in terms of trade. But in terms of military, and the rebalance strategy does have a very, very effective function. to contain China's military capability.
We have signed an agreement, a landmark document with the United States on climate change. That's one of the few areas where we can share common stakes. What are your interpretations about the growing sense of China being an international power to assume international responsibilities? Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who is elected to become the next president of the United States, said, you cannot take yourself as a developing country when you don't want to assume international responsibilities. Yeah. On the other hand, you come across as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a major power. So how should we look at your core interests?
I think you raised a very good question. On the one hand, the international community requires China to undertake more international responsibility. On the other hand, they claim China's policy is too assertive, right? From my understanding, if you want to be responsible, you must be very assertive. But for me, I think the other thing is most serious for China is that we must understand we're not the largest, the strongest country in the world. And we should only undertake the responsibility inconsistent with the power status as the second largest power. We are not the number one, we're number two. So nowadays you find that in some fields we have undertaken too much international responsibility beyond our capability, and we have provided too much foreign aid to the other countries, and even on the issue of the climate change. We must understand that we cannot assign the national interest or the goal is larger than the United States. And if the U.S. do not set up something like their goal, and if they do not take that kind of international responsibility, we must understand that we cannot undertake more than that.
Politicians, lawmakers, and decision makers in the United States all agree that they welcome a peaceful rise of China, and the prosperity of China could benefit the whole world on condition that China follows up the rules. Now, what do you think of the rules that they put forward? And at the same time, you suggest that China, when we are strong enough, should proactively help set up a new set of international norms. Yes. Are you serious about this? I mean, this could be viewed as a threat to the existing international order.
Well, one thing I think people always forget that, and the international norm change continuously. And so we call it an evolution of international norms. And any international norm existed forever. So the change of the norm is a normal phenomenon for international polities. And meanwhile for China, and if we have that capability to create new norms, which will be accepted by most countries, we should do. But then, if that beyond our capability, we shouldn't. So for instance, in terms of the trade, China is already the largest trader in the world. Certainly, we need to help the world to create new norms for the trade. But then, we are not the largest military power. It's beyond our capability to create military norms for the world.
What do you think of the double-edged sword of nationalism? Because we are having some of the most sensational territorial disputes. Okay. And do you think with the growing trend of commercial nationalism shared by some of the media players in this country, our peaceful rise is likely to be derailed?
I think we must make a clear distinction between nationalism and ultra-leftists. Nationalism refers to they prefer to adopt the tough foreign policy, but the ultra-leftists and they prefer adopt a left policy and to govern this country and to constrain people's activity and reduce people's freedom to do to decide their life. So from my understanding, and ultra-leftism only undermine our foreign policy, but ultra-leftist, I mean nationalism extreme nationalism may undermine our foreign policy, but ultra-leftism will undermine this country totally in all fields.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Beijing.
Media around the world have been talking about the ruling of the arbitral tribunal and its impact upon U.S.-China relationship. And I'd like to have your assessment about the influence of this ruling and what should be done to promote trust above all.
Well, I'd like to get a little away from the ruling at this point and talk about the broader U.S.-China relationship and the relationship going forward. I'm here speaking on a panel at the World Peace Forum where we're discussing what the United States and China should do to improve the relationship going forward. I think the key and fundamental question here is strategic mistrust. Two scholars, one Chinese and American, in 2012 wrote a very good paper. One was Wang Jise and the other was Ken Lee-Paul. That paper said that the fundamental difficulty is that Chinese mistrusts America's long-term intentions in the region, and the United States mistrusts China's long-term intentions in the region. How do you solve a problem that is that difficult? And I think that problem is growing. I think that China has misunderstood the pivot to Asia as something of a neo-containment strategy, which I do not believe that was the intention of President Obama at all. And on the other hand, the United States is using terms like China is an aggressive power now. I think that may be a misunderstanding of the Chinese position. One of the things that I was involved in the Bush administration was something called the strategic or the senior dialogue. And this was between Bob Zoellick at the time, you might remember, and senior Chinese officials like Dai Bingguo. I think we've gotten away from that. The strategic and economic dialogue today is a very big operation. 300 people on either side talking about issues. It's more a technocratic meeting than it is a meeting between senior officials where they deal intimately with each other and the issues. For example, I came with John Negroponte in one of those dialogues and went to Guiyang. For 2 days, Dai Bingguo and John Negroponte privately got to know each other, got to know each other's opinions. I think that's the kind of dialogue that we need to return to, no matter who wins the American election in the fall here. Because I think that only through that kind of senior personal diplomacy can we get away from some of these problems that we're having. We don't need more megaphone diplomacy between the United States and China. We need serious private discussions where we begin to understand each other's strategic positions better.
What insight can you provide from your inside perspective about what is likely to be going on and the discussion behind the scenes between Beijing and Washington, particularly about the South China Sea, because this is a flashpoint. I understand your reluctance to address the specific issue of the ruling, but South China Sea might be a touchstone, if not a tipping point for the male-to-male relationship.
Well, first of all, there are robust communications between Washington and Beijing at all times, and so I would expect in this situation there's a lot of discussion going on. I think the key at this point is to understand that it is in the interest of neither side for this to escalate. You mentioned the American naval presence. The American naval presence was to make a statement. It was to make a statement about freedom of navigation. I think the U.S. side has made that statement at this point, and there are many American thinkers who are now saying perhaps it's time to ratchet down the American presence in that area because we've made our point clear. And after the ruling, maybe we all need to take a little step back and take a breath and ratchet the situation down. So I think some of the discussion between Washington and Beijing now, I suspect, I don't know, is about how we can de-escalate this situation a bit. Perhaps supporting Philippine talks with China.
The latest FT editorial says there's no third choice other than arbitrary tribunal and gunboat policy. But China says, with regard to the UNCLOS, at the very beginning of this document, parties concerned are encouraged to, first of all, turn to negotiations. And China has always called for one-on-one dialogue with the Philippines, but probably because of their domestic politics, meaning the foreign minister was said to be very pro-US. he persuaded President Aquino to adopt a very tough confrontational approach by turning to The Hague. Do you think this time around the newly elected President Rodrigo Duterte will give peace a chance, give diplomacy a chance? Because after all, diplomacy has not been exhausted completely.
Now, though, that we're through the ruling, I think that it's time to get back to diplomacy. And one of the things I worry about is I think that the militaries on both sides have become a little bit loud in this situation. And perhaps it's time for the militaries to get a little quieter and the diplomats to get a little louder in this.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with the principle of safeguarding freedom of navigation and overflight. China is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the open world trade system, for example, WTO, and China rises so fast. As a result, why should China disrupt this freedom of navigation? China made it very clear over and over and over, it's not in our interest at all to disrupt the freedom of navigation, but no one listens. Instead, CNN crew was taken aboard and the civilians' plane to exaggerate the alleged China threat and assertiveness. And China feels, this is just a theater. It won't do anything helpful. Won't be very constructive for having a healthy dialogue. Do you think someone or some people in Washington who would like to blow this out of proportion so that it generates headlines for the military-industrial complex, so that up to 60% of the American armed forces will be pivoted to Asia, so that China's influence will be managed?
I think there are always people in both countries who see it in their own interests for the situation to get worse. And these individuals are interested in perhaps in arms trade, but I think they are also, again, concerned about where the world is going. And what we have to do, hopefully more reasoned minds have to explain to them that this isn't really in the interest of either the United States or China.
The United States says it remains neutral in any dispute, though I think we can admit that that clearly isn't the case. So what courses of action by all the parties involved, China, the Philippines, the United States, Vietnam, will be necessary to help bring tension down rather than pushing it even higher?
I think, as we've discussed, there are things that both sides can do in terms of their military activity in the South China Sea to bring the intensity down. I do have concerns that when such military activity increases, there is the risk of miscalculation. I was very much involved in trying to solve the EP3 crisis that occurred in April of 2001 at the beginning of the Bush administration. That was a terribly unfortunate incident between the United States and China. Had President Bush and President Jiang allowed it to, it could have derailed the American-Chinese relationship for a good long time. But both men found a way to step back from that issue and to build between them a great deal of trust. And I can tell you, as a member of the Bush administration, by the end of the Bush administration, when President Bush came here to the Olympics in Beijing, I think the level of trust between Chinese leader and the American leader was very high. And that's what I'm looking at in this situation. You have an unfortunate moment, you have an unfortunate disagreement, let's get beyond it and find a way to move to better ground.
What do you expect the next president to say on U.S.-China relationship? I know this is everybody's guess, whether Trump will beat his rival, Hillary Clinton, who, according to the latest survey, is viewed as dishonest on some of the issues, particularly the email scandal. I'm not asking you to put your money on either of the two.
I'm glad you're not, because I'm not sure how I would answer that question.
But are you optimistic that the next president, however tough he or she could talk about issues between our two countries, would stand ready to develop a very constructive relationship with the PRC?
I think that, to be honest with you, it's going to be a little tougher at the beginning of a new administration, whether it is Trump or whether it is Hillary Clinton. The reason is, as I was alluding to earlier, if you look at the American blue-collar laborer, not the high-paid laborers, but the lower-paid laborers in the United States, their incomes have been flat for about 20 years. Their incomes have not increased. And many of the industries these people used to work in are gone. Furniture, tool and die industries, some of the other manufacturing in places like Cleveland, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan, and some of these Midwestern areas. Rightly or wrongly, they blame the movement of factories to China. And the Trump phenomenon is about those people. This has to be addressed. Now, there are things on the American side we have to do. We have an income distribution problem. When bankers in New York earn $27 million a year, and the average median income is closer to, or median wage is closer to $20,000 a year, that's something America needs to figure out, how the benefits of globalization trickle down to the working classes. That's our problem. But China, on the other hand, has to listen to this issue and has to figure out how it can keep its markets open, even when it is feeling the pinch of a slowing growth rate. It can't be too protectionist. And American corporations working here in China, you can read the survey of the AmCham, say that the business environment has deteriorated for American companies here. And they give a list of things that could be done to make it more positive. China needs those American companies to send the message to Washington not to become protectionist. And so I'm asking that the Chinese government and the Chinese people think about how they can be friendlier to American corporations in order to improve the relationship.
Advice heeded. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.